discuss how the Church Fathers approach John 3:5 and infant baptism. Now, this question, some of you who have kind of followed the controversy surrounding Layton Flowers, or who are maybe fans of Layton Flowers or have just followed his work generally, know that Dr. Flowers has promoted the work of Ken Wilson. And Ken Wilson is a scholar who did his PhD at Oxford, and he did his dissertation on St. Augustine. Specifically, he addressed Augustine, what he calls Augustine's Manichean Gnosticism, which becomes essentially what he describes as Calvinism. It's very polemical, but it's not just polemical against Calvinism, but that's certainly the primary target that Dr. Flowers and Dr. Wilson are using in the arguments. And the argument basically is, well, all of the Christians, the Church Fathers beforehand, believed in a notion of libertarian free will. Augustine kind of shifted that conversation, and when Augustine did that, he was borrowing ideas or language from the Manicheans, who Augustine was a part of before his conversion to Christianity. So the argument is that he's grabbing onto these kind of pre-Christian ideas in his own life and putting them into this Christian context in his debate with Pelagius. So part of that argument, though, in Wilson's in his dissertation is that, and I haven't read the dissertation myself, this is just from other discussions that I've been a part of. I may read the dissertation myself. If I did, I could give a more thorough kind of exposition of the things that are discussed there. But from what people have sent me, quotations and stuff, there's been questions about what he says about baptismal regeneration. The argument is that he argues that Augustine is the first one to propose that the notion of being born of water and the Spirit in John 3 is about baptism, and that this is about baptismal regeneration. And he seems to, at least from what I've seen, associate the idea of any baptismal regeneration as if this is a notion that somehow Augustine pioneered. And that's just very obviously flat on its face. So what I can't do now, because I'm doing this on the spot, answering questions, is go through my Church Fathers. I still have my volumes out here. Those have not been packed yet. So I could do that. But if you do read from the Apostolic Fathers, there are very clear quotes in people like Justin Martyr, very clear quotes in Irenaeus, and going to Origen. There is really a unanimous, and I don't say this lightly because I hardly say there's unanimous consensus on anything in the Church Fathers. You really can't say that about much. But I have said in the past, and I will continue to say until it's demonstrated to me clearly that this is not unanimous, but at least as far as I've seen, there is a unanimous consensus of the Church Fathers on the idea, regarding the idea that baptism saves. Yes, you can debate exactly what that means and how that applies, but it's very clear that as early on as we get with the Fathers, they're teaching that baptism is not a symbolic action. It is certainly doing something saving. It is referred to as the waters of regeneration. I mean, this is very early, much prior to Augustine. And you can even go, Augustine's late. I mean, you have long expositions of baptism in people like Ambrose and Chrysostom and Athanasius and all sorts of figures, Cyprian and others. You can look at, the catechetical letters of Cyril of Jerusalem and all of these other sources that are very, very clear on baptismal efficacy. So what I think that kind of claim does in terms of Wilson's argument is that it demonstrates that he is not well acquainted with the Fathers. Now, that doesn't mean he hasn't read all of Augustine. I know the claim is he's read all of Augustine, but he's clearly not well versed in patristic theology enough that he misses what is one of the key doctrines. And I don't know any patristic scholar that would make the argument that there's some kind of innovation on Augustine's behalf in terms of this notion of baptismal regeneration and reading John 3 in that way and other texts. So I think that claim is just a false one. It's demonstrably false. I think you can really spend any significant period of time reading any of the Fathers. I mean, take a couple days and pick a few random treatises. So, and go ahead and read about that from the sources themselves, and read any, theology of the patristics. Read J.N.D. Kelly's book, or anything that's about early Christian doctrines. So that is my response to that claim. I think that's very clearly wrong. Augustine certainly did not innovate in that area. Now, it's not to say that Augustine didn't, because I had someone on Twitter say to me, well, Augustine to have anything original to say he wasn't special at all. And I think that's also a pretty absurd claim. I mean, everyone agrees that everyone who I know is a reputable scholar of patristics, they all argue that Augustine's a significant figure, and he's a significant turning point, especially for the Western Church. But the question is Augustine's significance all about total innovation in what he's saying? And I would say no, certainly not. Or is it largely about synthesizing earlier thought and, yes, expanding on certain things more and in more depth than other fathers had? I mean, he's got a brilliance that really outshines most of the other church fathers. So he's very, very significant, very, very important. But to say that he's significant, to say that he's important, to say that he does shift the discussion that happens after him does not mean that we have to say that he was a complete and total innovator. And on baptism, he certainly was not. You can also find quotes about guilt from birth, sin from one's birth. In Origen has a couple quotes like that. Yeah, you can find it in Ambrose. Certainly, I was reading through Ambrose for my justification course and just kept coming across citations after citations speaking in this way. Was it exactly formulated the way Augustine would formulate it? No. Was it in as much detail as Augustine would formulate it because of his debates with Pelagius? No. But the basic concept is still there as you find it in Augustine. And it would make a lot of sense that you find it in Ambrose because he's, a mentor to Augustine. So what do you expect? I mean, it makes sense that that's where he's getting these ideas from. And I think Ambrose is a very significant figure for Augustine. And to just say that he's borrowing these notions from the Manicheans and the Gnostics is really missing what I think is a key part of his theological development, which is Ambrose, because he says many of the same things that Augustine would later say.